London, October 1814. The candles in Hartwell House had never burned so bright, and Seraphine Voss had never felt so alone inside their light. 200 guests filled the grand ballroom that October evening, their laughter rising to the painted ceiling like smoke from a fire no one was tending. The women wore silks the color of bruised roses and summer sky. The men stood in tight clusters near the fireplace, gold buttons glinting, voices low and satisfied with themselves. Seraphine stood near the south wall, her ivory gown pressed with care, her dark hair pinned with the pearl comb her late father had given her on her 18th birthday. She could not see any of it. She had not seen anything in 4 years. But she could feel the warmth of the candles on her left cheek, the slight draft from the door that told her she was 7 steps from the nearest exit, and feel, with the particular sharpness of someone who has lost one sense and gained 3 others, that something in this room had been changed. Someone had moved the chair. She had memorized this ballroom. She had attended Hartwell House 3 times before and walked its dimensions with her cane, cataloging every column, every step, every corner. The chair near the south wall, a wide-backed thing with gilded legs, had always sat 2 feet from the wall. Tonight it was not there. She stepped forward, expecting space, and found only air where the chair should have been, before her heel caught the leg of something low and unexpected. A footstool, placed precisely where no footstool had ever been placed before. She lurched. Her cane skidded on the polished floor. And Seraphine Voss, daughter of the late Duke of Whitmore, a woman who had survived 4 years of darkness with her dignity untouched, fell. Not gently. Not quietly. She fell hard enough for the sound to carry across the room, and the music stopped, and 200 people turned at once, and what followed the silence was laughter. Not all of it, but enough. Enough to be the only sound she could hear. She lay there for exactly 3 seconds. 3 seconds in which she could feel the cold marble through her gown, smell the beeswax on the floor, and hear the laughter rippling outward like rings in still water. 3 seconds in which every nerve in her body screamed at her to stay down, to stay invisible, to let the floor swallow her whole. She did not. Seraphine pressed her gloved palm flat against the marble, found her cane, and rose. Slowly, deliberately, the way her father had taught her to rise after any fall, not with haste, because haste betrayed panic, and panic was the only thing more dangerous than blindness in a room full of enemies. She rose straight, found her balance, smoothed her gown with one hand. She turned her face toward the room and said nothing. She did not need to. The silence that followed her rising was louder than the laughter had been. Her jaw was set like iron. Her eyes, pale gray and sightless, looked out at a room she could not see, and somehow, impossibly, the room looked away first. From across the ballroom, Lord Evander Crail lifted his champagne glass and smiled. He was 43 years old, with a jaw like a spade and eyes the color of old pewter. He wore his medals openly, 4 of them, though only 2 had been honestly earned. He had been watching Seraphine Voss for the better part of a year, watching her manage the Whitmore estate from behind a veil of blindness, watching the way she quietly won. And that was precisely the problem. The Whitmore estate sat on 3,000 acres in Surrey, but more critically, it commanded a supply corridor of enormous military value. France and England were in the final, dangerous chapter of their long war, and Crail had made promises to certain men in Paris about that corridor. He had promised them access. He had promised them silence. And Seraphine Voss, with her sharp ears and her inconvenient intelligence, was standing between him and everything he had promised. So he had arranged the footstool. A small cruelty, he had told himself. A warning. Near the far end of the room, Caspian Aldrich, Duke of Ravenmore, set down his glass. He had not laughed. He had not moved. He stood 6'2" in his dark coat, still as a stone in a stream, watching the woman in ivory rise from the marble floor with more composure than anyone in the room deserved to witness. He had been back in London only 9 days after 3 years in Portugal and Spain, watching men die in the mud for reasons that were worked out in rooms exactly like this one, by people exactly like the ones now chuckling behind their fans. He had come tonight because his solicitor had mentioned something about a land dispute and the Whitmore estate, something he hadn't given sufficient attention to. Now he was paying attention. The woman stood with her cane at her side, her face composed as carved stone, and Caspian felt something move in his chest that he had not felt in years. Not pity. He had no patience for pity. Something harder and quieter. Something that felt like recognition. Her maid, a small fierce woman named Dosi, was at Seraphine's side in seconds, taking her elbow with a grip that was both gentle and furious. "We are leaving," Dosi whispered, the words almost soundless. Seraphine did not argue. She allowed herself to be guided toward the doors, each step deliberate, her cane tapping its quiet rhythm, her head perfectly level. She heard the whispers as she passed. The blind duchess, they called her. It had started as a taunt. She had never been a duchess by marriage, though she was the last living heir of a dukedom. The title had become a kind of bitter joke in London drawing rooms. No duke would have her. No sane man would tie his fortune and name to a woman who couldn't see. She had heard it said so many times that it had almost stopped cutting. Almost. Tonight, the edge of it was sharp again. Tonight, someone had put a footstool in her path on purpose, and she knew it. And somewhere in this gilded room the person who had done it was still smiling. They were nearly to the corridor when she heard them. Two voices, low and male, in the alcove beside the great doors. One voice she did not know. The other was Lord Crail's, a voice she had memorized months ago, out of necessity, out of survival. "The shipment moves in 3 weeks," Crail was saying. "Once the documents transfer, Ravensmoor's regiment loses its supply advantage and the French take the northern pass before March." The pause. The clink of glass. "And the woman?" the second voice said. "The girl is blind," Crail answered, with a softness that was worse than contempt. "She is no threat to anyone." Seraphine did not stop walking. She did not tighten her grip on Dosi's arm. She allowed herself to be walked through the corridor and out into the cool October night, into the smell of horses and autumn fog. And she said nothing at all. Because the first rule her father had ever taught her was this: when you learn a dangerous secret, you smile, and you walk, and you let them believe you heard nothing. And then you destroy them at a time of your own choosing. Surrey and London, 1810 to 1813. For years before the footstool, before the laughter, before the cold marble floor, Seraphine Voss had been able to see everything. She had stood in the window of Whitmore Hall with her father's old brass telescope and traced the line where the Surrey hills rolled into each other like sleeping shoulders, and she had thought there was nothing in the world more beautiful than the view from that window at dawn. The hall itself was old, built in the time of Queen and, with wide stone floors and windows set deep into thick walls and a library that smelled permanently of tobacco and good leather and her father's particular brand of certainty about the world. The Duke of Whitmore, Edmund Voss, seventh of his line, had been a man of great intelligence and modest warmth, one who expressed love through information rather than tenderness. He taught his daughter Latin, mathematics, military history, and the art of reading people because he had no son and saw no reason that should matter. He told her regularly that a woman who could truly think was worth 10 men who merely performed thinking. She believed him completely. She had no reason not to. It was the summer of 1810 when the carriage overturned on the road between Guildford and London. She was 22. She was riding with her father and his secretary, a young man named Felix who died instantly when the carriage turned over in the July rains. The bank of the road had crumbled in the storms and the carriage went down sideways into the ditch, and when Seraphine woke in a physician's room 3 days later, the world was dark and it never came back. The physicians called it a trauma to the optic nerve. They said the word permanent in careful, low voices, as if softness of tone could cushion the weight of a sentence like that. Her father sat beside her bed and held her hand without speaking for a long time. Then he said, "You are still you." It was the least comforting and most important thing anyone could have said. She cried once, deeply, for half a night. Then she stopped. Then she began to learn. She mapped her father's library by touch and rebuilt her sense of every room in Whitmore Hall by memory until she moved through it as fluently as any sighted person. Her father died in the spring of 1813, a fever that the physician caught too late, in a winter that had not known when to end. He died in his own bed with Seraphine beside him, her hand over his, and his last words were a property law she had not known, spoken clearly and precisely because right until the end he was teaching her what she would need. The estate passed immediately into a complicated legal situation. There was no male heir. There were distant cousins. There were solicitors with unpleasant smiles who arrived within the week, speaking to her in the simplified tones one uses with children and the unwell. The title itself was in dispute. The Whitmore dukedom by the terms of its original charter could not pass through the female line, or so the solicitors informed her. She did not believe them. She had her father's books. She had his letters. And she had the particular clarity of mind that comes from having nothing left to lose. She hired her own solicitor, a man named Parrish who wore rumpled coats and won every case he took. She was not finished. She had barely started. London had noticed. London always noticed. What had once been polite sympathy, the Duke's poor blind daughter, became something crueler as the estate dispute dragged on. She was seen occasionally in the city, navigating with her cane, conducting her business, refusing to be managed. Society did not know what to do with her. A blind woman of rank who would not retreat to the country, would not accept charitable matches from kind families, would not be diminished. They gave her the name as a taunt, the blind Duchess. As if the Duchess part were a joke because it was not yet legally real, as if the blind part were the most important thing about her. She let them call her it. She let them talk. Every whisper taught her something. She had built a network of information that would have shamed a government spy. Her maid Dosey was relentless. The cook at her rented house on Blythe Street had a sister who worked in Lord Crail's kitchen, and the bootblack near Parliament had ears like a hunting dog. Seraphine paid them all in coin and genuine kindness, and catalogued everything she heard in a memory sharpened to the edge of a blade. She had known about Lord Crail for 8 months before the Hartwell ball. Had known he wanted the Whitmore estate, that his interest went beyond its social value. The specific details, the supply corridor, the French connection, had come to her in fragments. A word here, a name there. The estate's south road was the fastest route between the coast and the Midlands. In wartime, such things carried military value that money alone could not calculate. She had written 3 letters to the War Office, politely and precisely laying out what she suspected. She received 3 replies from men who addressed her as Miss Voss and told her, in varying degrees of condescension, that her concerns had been noted. She understood entirely. A blind woman with no formal title, writing about military logistics from a rented house on Blythe Street. Of course they had set the letters aside. She filed the replies in her memory alongside their dates and signatures, because she was a patient woman, and her father had taught her that evidence gathered slowly holds the longest. The question was only when. And now, hearing Crail's voice in that alcove, she understood that when had arrived. There was one more piece of the story that London did not know. Her blindness, the physicians had said, might not be permanent. There was a specialist in Edinburgh, a surgeon named Dr. Renfrew, who had studied under continental masters and published research on traumatic optic injuries, who had written to her father 2 months before his death suggesting that her case might be treatable. The letter had arrived after her father's passing, intercepted and then delivered with the seal broken and pressed closed again with inferior wax. She had felt that seal with her fingertips and known. Someone had read it first. Someone who wanted her to believe there was no hope. She had written to Dr. Renfrew herself 3 times, but his replies had not come through her usual channels. She did not know if the letters had been intercepted. She did not know if she might one day see again. She had stopped allowing herself to think about it directly, the way you stop touching a bruise, not because it doesn't hurt, but because the hurt serves nothing. What she needed was not her sight. What she needed was justice. First, always justice first. Then hope could have its turn. In the carriage back to Blythe Street that October night, Seraphine sat with her hands folded in her lap and her ears open to everything. The creak of the wheels, the sound of other carriages passing in the foggy dark, the distant shout of a street seller. She thought about what she had heard. The shipment moves in 3 weeks. Ravenmore's regiment. She knew who the Duke of Ravenmore was. He had come back from the Peninsula campaigns with 2 medals and a reputation for ruthlessness that was either admired or feared depending on who you asked. She had heard him described as cold and arrogant and unfeeling. She had heard him described as the finest strategic mind of his generation. She had not heard him described as a man who would stand in a ballroom and refuse to laugh at a blind woman on a marble floor. But he had not laughed. She had heard the room with absolute clarity, and his voice, a low and steady baritone, had not joined the laughter. That was the kind of detail a patient woman filed away for later. Dulcie squeezed her hand in the dark. Seraphine squeezed back. 3 weeks. London, late October 1814. Caspian Aldrich had not wanted to come back to London. He had spent 3 years preferring the brutal honesty of the battlefield to the elaborate dishonesty of the drawing room, and nothing in his 9 days home had changed that preference. The house on Grosvenor Square was his by inheritance, marble-floored and cold, staffed by servants who moved with the particular silent caution of people who had learned that their duke did not welcome noise or conversation beyond necessity. He had arrived to find 12 invitations on his desk, a land dispute requiring his attention, and a note from his solicitor about an overlapping boundary claim with the Whitmore estate. He had not yet addressed any of it. He had spent his first 3 days walking. London was a different city after 3 years of war. The people in it seemed simultaneously louder and less real. They talked about Napoleon as if he were a character in a novel, about the campaign as if it were a sporting event. He had watched men die in the Pyrenees in conditions that would have stopped their conversation entirely, and he found he could not quite forgive London for being London. He had gone to the Hartwell ball because his solicitor had mentioned that the Whitmore solicitor, a Mr. Parrish, would be present. What he had not expected was the woman. He had noticed her when he arrived. The stillness of her, the way she stood near the south wall with her cane at her side, composure in every line of her, while the room moved around her like a river around a stone. He had asked the woman beside him who she was. The answer came with a small, unkind smile. "Oh, that is the blind Duchess. Of us. Some say she'll fight the courts for her father's title until she dies and never hold it. Poor creature. Quite mad, really, to even try." He had looked at the woman in ivory for a long moment after that. She did not look mad. She looked like someone doing a very precise calculation. And then the music had stopped, and she had fallen, and the room had laughed, and something in Caspian's chest had shifted from assessment into something he had not felt in years. Not pity. Never pity. Something closer to fury at the smallness of the world he had come home to. He left the ball 20 minutes after she did. He walked home instead of taking his carriage, because the night air was cold and clear and he needed clarity more than warmth. He passed through the avenue of plane trees, their bare October branches cutting the fog-gray sky into fragments, and he thought about her face when she rose from the floor. The particular expression of a person who has absorbed pain so many times that absorption has become their architecture. He had seen that expression before, on soldiers, not all soldiers, only the particular kind who understood that grief was a thing you carried rather than displayed. He had worn that expression himself for 3 years. He recognized it the way you recognize a word in a foreign language you had not known you knew. He arrived home, dismissed the waiting footman, went to his desk, and spent the rest of the evening reading every document his solicitor had sent about the boundary dispute. The land in question was a strip of road connecting a naval supply depot to northern distribution points. In wartime, that was not a civilian matter. That was a strategic asset. And someone had manufactured the dispute to control it. What he found in those documents disturbed him more than a battlefield had in years. The survey documents were dated inconsistently, and one surveyor's name he did not recognize appeared in multiple files. He had seen this kind of manufactured confusion before, in Spain, where enemy sympathizers had seeded false property documents into local records to create delays and diversions in military supply routes. He had spent 3 years learning how enemies worked, and this looked like an enemy's handwriting. He wrote a note to his solicitor to postpone all Whitmore boundary proceedings. Then he wrote a second note to a man named Graves, not his real name, but the only one Caspian had ever used for him. Graves worked near Whitehall in a building with no identifying signage and dealt in information the way other men dealt in wool. Caspian had worked with him twice during the campaign. His note said only, "I have a concern with military implications. I also have a name." He folded it and sent it with Orwell, his most trusted servant, a man who had survived Talavera and could be trusted with his life, which Caspian had verified in the specific and final way that wars alone allow. 3 days after the ball, Caspian Aldrich arrived at the door of a rented house on Blythe Street and knocked. The house was narrow and clean, its window boxes empty for the season, its door painted the dark green of old pine trees. A small, fierce-looking woman opened the door and looked at him with the expression of someone who expected trouble and was entirely equipped to manage it. "The Duke of Ravenmore," he said. "I would like to speak with Miss Voss." The woman looked him over with the frank appraisal of a ship's captain examining a vessel of uncertain seaworthiness. "Does she know you?" "She does not." "Then you may wait." She shut the door with perfect courtesy and absolute firmness. He waited on the step for 6 minutes. When the door opened again, behind the maid, in the narrow hallway, stood Seraphine Voss. She was wearing a plain dark dress, her hair loose over one shoulder, nothing like the carefully assembled woman from the ball. She was somehow more remarkable for it. "Your Grace," she said. Not a question. Not a welcome. A statement, with weight pressed into both syllables. He was shown into a sitting room that surprised him entirely. He had expected something wan and careful, the home of a woman managing on limited means. It was not. The room was organized with a precision that went beyond tidiness, everything placed with clear intention, chairs angled exactly so, shelves arranged by height so she could reach by count rather than sight. There were maps, 2 large ones, pinned to a board near the window, covered in markings he could not immediately interpret. Letters were arranged in flat stacks on the desk, their edges aligned with geometric exactness. On the mantel was a brass inkwell, a small leather-bound book, and a portrait of the late Duke of Whitmore. The room smelled of beeswax, cold tea, and the particular damp of autumn London. She waited until he sat, then sat opposite him, her hands folded, her gray eyes aimed at a point slightly to his left, close but not exact, which told him she was orienting by his breathing. "You have come about the boundary dispute," she said. It was not entirely a question. "No," he replied, watching her face very carefully. "I have come about Crail." The name landed in the room like a stone in still water. He watched for a reaction and saw almost none, only the briefest tightening around her jaw, a pause of perhaps half a second before she answered. He told her what he had found in the documents, the manufactured surveyor, the inconsistent dates, the strategic value of the South Road. He told it to her the way he would have told a fellow officer, plainly, with no softening, no condescension, because he had decided on the walk to Blythe Street that she had earned that. She listened without interrupting. She asked 2 questions, both precise, both demonstrating a knowledge of military supply logistics that stopped him mid-sentence on the second. He looked at her with undisguised assessment. "You know considerably more about this than most people," he said. She tilted her head slightly. "I have had 4 years to listen and very few distractions from it." He sat with that for a moment, the weight of what 4 years of listening from the dark could build. Then he said, "What did you hear in the alcove at Hartwell House?" She calculated. He felt it. And then, steadily and without drama, she told him everything. London, November 1814. She told him what she had heard, all of it. The shipment. The documents. The supply routes. The French General Messina and the Northern Pass. She told it without drama, without emphasis, in a plain and quiet voice that made the words more chilling for their very plainness. When she finished, Caspian sat very still. He had suspected treason. This was confirmation. "You wrote to the War Office," he said, not a question because he had guessed it from the stacks of letters on her desk. "3 times, she said. "They noted my concerns." The bitterness in those 4 words was thin as a blade and twice as sharp. He knew the feeling precisely. He had written reports from the field that had vanished into ministerial desks, reports about supply vulnerabilities and sympathizer networks, reports that had gone unread until men died. "They would listen to you," she said then. Her voice was even, not accusing, simply and painfully true. He felt the weight of that truth press against something deeply uncomfortable in his chest. "Yes," he said quietly. "They would." A silence. "Then I am asking you to carry what I know," she said, "and to ensure I am present when it matters. Not as a footnote. As a source." He agreed. He told himself it was pragmatic. She had information he needed, delivered in a form he trusted. He told himself it had nothing to do with the maps on her wall or the questions she had asked with a general's precision, nothing to do with the way she held herself. He went back to Grosvenor Square and spent the following 3 days excavating everything he could find about Evander Crale. What he assembled was a portrait of extraordinary and sustained dishonesty. Crale had debts hidden under shell arrangements with 3 banking houses. He had made 2 trips to the continent during the temporary peace, under the cover of cultural tourism, and had met with men whose names now appeared in Graves' intelligence files. He had friends in the War Ministry, not friends exactly, but men who owed him favors, men whose names appeared alongside the Manufactured Land Survey. And he had a particular habit, noted independently by 2 of Caspian's sources, of appearing wherever the Whitmore estate's legal matters were being discussed. He wanted the South Road with a desperation that had crossed the line into treason. And he was 3 weeks away from completing his transaction. Graves came back with a complication. The documents Crale was moving, military supply maps that would expose Ravensmoor's regiment to French interdiction, were not originals. They were copies, made by an inside contact. The originals remained in the War Office, and the contact had not yet completed the transfer. They were waiting for a triggering event. The investigation could not move in official channels without risking the leak. If Crale learned he was being watched, the documents would move immediately and the window to catch him acting would close permanently. They needed him confident, unwatched, and certain of his own safety. They needed him to proceed exactly as planned. And Caspian, reading Graves' message at 2 in the morning with November rain against his study windows, understood with cold clarity what that required. He needed to be visible. He needed to give Crale something to watch while the real work was done quietly at its own pace. He needed a reason to be seen, convincingly, repeatedly, with Seraphine Voss. He went back to Blythe Street the following morning with this proposal and was not surprised to find her already considering some version of the same conclusion. She was several steps ahead of most people at most times. London noticed within the week. A duke freshly returned from the wars calling twice on the blind Duchess in her Blythe Street house. He had taken her to the lending library. She wanted to collect a book she was expecting from Edinburgh. He offered his arm in the street, not because she needed it. She navigated the city with the calm certainty of someone who had learned its rhythms by sound and memory, but because London was watching and the performance required contact. She accepted his arm with the expression of someone accepting a useful tool. They made an extraordinary picture on that October pavement. The tall, dark duke and the pale, blind woman moving through the street as if they belonged together, which they did not then. People stared. People gossiped. And somewhere across the city, Lord Evander Crale heard about it by evening, because Caspian had ensured that the right people were in the lending library to observe and report. He knew the mechanism of London's information network as well as he knew the mechanism of a field campaign. You placed the bait precisely where the enemy was looking. Then you waited with total patience, which was the hardest part of any strategy and the part most people failed. The Edinburgh package changed something. The book Seraphine collected from the lending library contained a letter hidden inside its cover, not print, but a message traced in a raised pattern that her fingertips could read. It was from Dr. Renfrew in Edinburgh. He had written, finally, after her 3rd letter reached him through a new route arranged through Mr. Parrish. He had written that he believed her injury was operable, that there was a surgical procedure, developed from recent continental research, that carried real risk but offered genuine possibility, that he put the probability of restored vision at better than even. She read this message in her sitting room that evening, alone, DUCHESS sent on an errand. She held the cover of the book with both hands and breathed with the careful steadiness of someone who has been holding a door closed for a very long time and has just been told, with cautious certainty, that there might be something worth opening it for. She did not tell Caspian about this. It was hers. It was deeply private. And there were more urgent matters. 3 weeks was now 17 days. The inside contact was identified. His name was Holcomb, a debt-ridden ministry clerk who had decided Creel's money was preferable to ruin. But there was a second man, more senior, Colonel Beecham, who had access to the exact cabinet of maps and deployment papers that would expose Ravenmore's regiment. Caspian had served with Beecham in Portugal. When Seraphine gave him the name, she did it plainly and quickly, the way a physician delivers a diagnosis they know will hurt. He sat with it for a full minute. "How certain are you?" "As certain as I am of anything," she said, which was, they both understood, quite certain indeed. He arranged for Beauchamp's access to the map cabinet to be quietly restricted on a pretext that would not alert Creel. It was a move that required both precision and extraordinary restraint, because the natural impulse was to confront and arrest. But they needed the transfer to happen, and they needed to be there when it did. The mission now had a date, November 21st, at a reception hosted by Lord Hartwell, the same room where she had fallen and risen and heard everything. London had a habit, she was learning, of bringing things full circle. In the 6 days before the 21st, Seraphine prepared with the intensity of a general before a decisive engagement. She rebuilt the Hartwell House library from memory, its dimensions, its fireplace, its 2 high windows, the writing table near the north end where the carpet changed from blue to green. She walked a replica of the room in her Blythe Street sitting room, using its furniture as stand-ins, until she could move through it without sound or hesitation. She practiced operating the small recording device Caspian had borrowed from a man of science, a cylinder with a wax surface that could capture and preserve sound, until she could operate it with one hand in complete darkness. Because she was always in the dark. That was her element, and she had long since decided that this was not a disadvantage. She could hear what sighted people could not. She could listen in a crowd while appearing to be doing something else entirely. She could stand in an alcove beside a library door and receive, with absolute clarity, every word spoken inside it. And she could, if necessary, deliver that testimony in a court of law in a voice so precise and so unshakable that no barrister in England would be able to move her from it. He told her the night before, "If Creel realizes what you are doing, he will not dismiss you this time." She understood what he meant. Not humiliation. Not a footstool. The kind of danger that ended things. She sat with that, not with fear, but with the clear-eyed acknowledgement of a woman who had already filed her written account that morning with Parrish, sealed, to be opened if she did not return by midnight. "I understand," she said. "Then, I said I understand," she said quietly. "Not that I refuse. When have I refused a risk because it was large?" There was a long pause in the sitting room, and then, from the Duke of Ravenmore, who had not laughed in a ballroom when all of London had, came a sound she had not heard from him before. A laugh, quiet and low and entirely genuine. It changed the room. It changed the air between them. She did not say anything, but she felt the change settle into her chest like the first warm day after a very long winter, and she sat very still and let herself hold it for just a moment before she stood to go to bed. London, November 1814. There is a thing about powerful men that they never learn, because learning it would require them to be a different kind of person than they are. They overlook the servants. Creel held 2 private dinners in the 10 days following the Hartwell ball, dinners at which specific men gathered in his mahogany dining room on the pretense of friendship, and at which the real conversation happened after the port was poured and the servants were dismissed. He dismissed them with the particular impatience of a man who genuinely does not believe that the people who refill his glass are human enough to remember what they hear. No one watched when a footman stayed 1 minute longer in the corridor than necessary. No one noticed when the woman who brought the second decanter paused in the shadows by the kitchen passage door, her face perfectly blank, her ears wide open. That footman had a sister who bought bread from the same woman who sold bread to DUCHESS. The information moved through a chain so fine and so domestic that no surveillance agent in London's intelligence apparatus would have thought to follow it. A chain of invisible people whom Seraphine had spent 2 years making feel seen. By the second week of November, she had 2 names from Creel's private dinners. Holcomb was the first, the ministry clerk with the gambling debt large enough to ruin him. The second was the Colonel, Beecham. She gave them to Caspian in her cipher, not the standard system she knew Graves used, but her own, constructed from a grid she had memorized entirely and could reconstruct without paper, without sight, without anything but the architecture of her own exceptionally trained mind. He decoded it and looked up. Beecham. Yes. He was quiet for an unusually long time. He was in Portugal with me. I know. His voice was flat and very carefully controlled. I am sorry, she said. And she understood what it meant to discover that someone you had trusted in conditions that forged trust was not what you believed them to be. How certain are you? He asked. As certain as I am of anything. That answer, they had both learned, was the only kind he fully trusted, precise, honest, and free of false comfort. The days developed a rhythm she had not expected. He came to Blythe Street each morning and they worked, not in the manner of 2 people who liked each other, not initially, but in the manner of 2 people who respected each other's competence, which is its own kind of intimacy. He told her things about the campaign she had no other way of knowing. The physical layout of supply routes, the logistical vulnerabilities, the weight of what would happen to the men in Ravenmore's regiment if their supply lines were cut before spring. She told him things he had no other way of knowing, the invisible architecture of London's information flow, the names and habits of people who saw without being seen. They were translating each other's worlds, and each translation was a small act of trust that cost something real. She noticed that he never spoke down to her. He corrected her once, on a point of military geography, and when she produced the document that proved her right, he said simply, I stand corrected, and moved on without drama. She had not known how rare that was until it happened. The public performance continued alongside the private work. They appeared at 3 events in as many weeks, always visible enough to keep Creel's attention occupied without being intimate enough to seem serious. London was fascinated and baffled in equal measure. The Duke of Ravenmore, cold, decorated, admired from a distance, appearing repeatedly with the blind Duchess, the object of 100 unkind jokes. Society could not decide what to make of it. Some said he was after her estate. Some said the war had made him odd. A few sharp-eyed observers said nothing and simply watched with growing interest. Lady Fontaine, who had placed the footstool at Creel's direction, had grown visibly uneasy. Seraphine knew this through Dosey, who had it from Lady Fontaine's own lady's maid, a young woman named Prue who had never liked what she had been asked to participate in and who, when she realized Seraphine was not what she had been told, became quietly and carefully useful. The footstool had been deliberate. That was evidence of a kind, not the kind that would stand in a court, but the kind that told Seraphine exactly what she was dealing with and confirmed that Creel considered her an obstacle worth removing. Graves confirmed the transfer date on November 13th. The documents would move on the 21st. 8 days. The plan required that on that date, Creel would pass the copied supply maps to an intermediary named Sefton, who would carry them to a French contact on the coast. Graves had Sefton under surveillance. Beauchamp's access had been quietly restricted. But they needed more than surveillance and restriction. They needed the transfer itself to be witnessed and documented by someone whose testimony could not be dismissed or discredited. A blind woman's account, however precise, would be challenged by any competent defense. A duke's word carried weight, but without independent corroboration was insufficient for a treason charge against a man of Creel's connections. They needed a third witness of standing, or they needed the conversation recorded in a form that a court could examine directly. The small mechanical cylinder Caspian had borrowed was their best chance at the latter. If it worked, if it captured enough, If the room's acoustics cooperated. There were several ifs. Seraphine was accustomed to working under conditions of imperfect certainty. The key was not eliminating the ifs. It was preparing so thoroughly that the ifs became manageable. She thought about him when he was not there. She noticed this with the detached precision she applied to most things about herself, cataloging it without judgment. She noticed the specific quality his presence added to a room, a particular steadiness, a refusal to perform emotions he didn't feel, and the specific quality of its absence. She thought about the laugh in the sitting room, the one she had not expected, the one that had changed the air. She thought about the way he had described why he hadn't laughed in the ballroom. I had not seen it in a drawing room before. It seemed like something that deserved to be witnessed. She had been witnessed by people her whole life, witnessed and reduced, witnessed and pitted, witnessed and dismissed. She had never been witnessed in the way he meant, as a thing of value, a thing that deserved the particular gravity of a serious person's attention. She was not foolish enough to mistake the utility of their arrangement for something else. She was also not, she admitted to herself in the dark of her bedroom on the 14th of November, entirely successful at keeping the two things completely separate. On the 15th she received a note from Graves. Crail had become suspicious, not of Seraphine directly, but of the general situation. Some element of the net being drawn around him had created a subtle shift in his behavior. He had cancelled one social engagement, used a different courier for a communication Graves had been monitoring, and made an unscheduled visit to a banking house. He had not yet run. He had not yet altered the transfer date. But he was a man who had survived in the shadow world of treason for long enough to have instincts, and his instincts were beginning to stir. They had 6 days remaining. 6 days in which Crail needed to feel safe enough to proceed. 6 days in which the performance of Caspian's courtship, if you could call it that, needed to be convincing enough to account for whatever attention Ravensmore's name had attracted. That evening, Caspian took her to the theater. She could not see the stage. She could hear it. She heard the music and the voices and the particular quality of an audience in the grip of something beautiful, and she sat beside him in the dark of the box and listened, and he did not speak, and the silence between them was the most comfortable thing she had felt in 4 years. She slept well that night for the first time in weeks. She woke before dawn to the sounds of Blythe Street beginning its morning, the bread cart, the sweep, the first carriages. She lay in the dark that was not different from any other dark and thought through the plan one more time, beginning to end, every variable accounted for. She found nothing she had not already prepared for. Except one thing, which was not a variable in the plan but a variable in herself. The increasing difficulty of maintaining the clear and professional separation between what this was, a mission, a strategy, a calculated arrangement, and what it had begun, very quietly, to feel like. She got up. She dressed. She went to her desk. She worked. Because the mission was in 6 days and she was not the kind of person who allowed feelings to interfere with work, particularly when the work involved protecting the lives of men she had never met, camped at a river crossing in a country she had never seen, who had no idea that a blind woman on Blythe Street was the thing standing between them and an ambush they would never see coming. Hartwell House, November 21, 1814. The morning of November the 21st was grey and cold, the kind of London morning that smells of coal smoke and patience, the sky a flat pewter that promised nothing pleasant but at least nothing worse. Seraphine dressed carefully in a dark blue gown, understated, the kind that would render her a background figure in a crowded room rather than a center of attention. She ate breakfast and said very little. Caspian arrived at 8, earlier than usual, in a coat that smelled of cold air and horse leather. He did not offer pleasantries. Neither did she. The silence between them that morning had a specific quality, the silence of two people who have said everything that needs saying and are now in the forward part of the work, where words become noise and clarity becomes the only currency that matters. He told her Graves had confirmed the meeting in the library was scheduled for 10:30, during the reception's first hour, when the room would be loudest and the library most plausibly unoccupied. Sefton would come for the documents. The transfer would be Crail and Sefton, alone, in the library. and Seraphine would be positioned close enough to hear every word. They arrived at Hartwell House at 9:30, early enough to establish their presence before the larger crowd arrived. Caspian walked beside her, not guiding, not hovering, she had been very explicit about this, but close enough for the appearance of companionship. The footmen at the door would remember them arriving together and arriving early, which was essential for what came after. Inside, the reception was beginning to fill with the particular morning noise of society gathering, the clink of cups, the roar of competing conversations, the creak of fine shoes on marble floors. She oriented immediately, cataloging sounds, distances, and temperature changes that told her where the doors were open and where they were closed. The library was behind the east staircase. She had been in that room once, 2 years before, and had rebuilt it entirely from a single visit. Long and narrow, 2 high windows, a fireplace on the west wall, bookshelves floor to ceiling, and a writing table near the north end where the carpet changed from blue to green. 6 weeks of mental preparation had made it as familiar as her own bedroom. She moved toward the east staircase with the unhurried composure of someone who belongs exactly where she is. She stationed herself in the alcove beside the library door, the same kind of alcove where she had first heard Betrayal at the ball, 6 weeks and a lifetime ago. A symmetry she noted with the dark amusement of someone who did not waste coincidences. Caspian stood with her, close enough for the appearance of conversation, far enough that her hearing was unobstructed. They waited. She could hear the reception through the wall, its cumulative roar, the footsteps on marble, the occasional burst of laughter. At 10:25, she heard footsteps she recognized. Betrayal walked differently from other men, a slight drag on the left heel, a remnant of some old injury. She had catalogued that drag 8 months ago and never forgot it. The drag moved toward the library door, stopped. A key turned. The door opened. She released a slow breath, activated the recording cylinder, and handed it to Caspian, who held it still against the wall beside the door frame. The device was experimental. It might not work. The backup was her testimony and his. The backup after that was the sealed letter she had given Parrish that morning, to be opened if she did not return by midnight. 8 minutes passed. She counted them in heartbeats, which was steadier than counting seconds. Then the library door opened again and different footsteps approached, lighter, faster, the energy of someone conducting a transaction they wished were already behind them. Sefton. The door closed again. Through the wall, even through the noise of the reception, she could hear voices. Not words yet. Then the quality of the corridor changed. A group of guests passing near the alcove, creating a wave of noise, and she touched Caspian's arm and he understood immediately, stepping forward to present them as a couple paused in conversation, blocking sight lines, while she pressed her ear to the wall. The guests moved on. In the silence that followed, she heard, all 3 routes. The northern pass is confirmed. Betrayal's voice, clear and cold as iron. Ravenmore's regiment camps at the Segura crossing by February. The supply depot coordinates are marked. When Messina moves, a second voice, lower, and the woman, the pause. Not your concern. Betrayal, if she's told the Duke, she is blind and she is nothing, Betrayal said. Give Messina the maps. She stepped back from the wall. Her hands were perfectly steady. She was extraordinary at that. The steadiness, the refusal to shake when everything inside her was moving like a storm. She had it, all of it. Treason, spoken plainly, with names and routes and a French general's name and a regiment's position and a man's voice identifying himself beyond any possible doubt. She turned toward Caspian and said very quietly, I have it. He pressed his hand over hers, a contact that lasted exactly 2 seconds and communicated in those 2 seconds more than either of them had yet managed with words. Then they moved. Not quickly. Quickly would have been wrong, would have drawn attention, would have fractured the performance they had maintained for 6 weeks. They moved with the unhurried purpose of 2 people who have nowhere pressing to be, down the corridor and back into the reception, joining the outer edge of the crowd, accepting cups of tea from a passing tray with perfect composure. 3 minutes later, Graves appeared at the door of the reception. Behind him was a magistrate, exactly as arranged. She handed Caspian the recording cylinder and stood very still while everything she had worked toward for 8 months began its final, decisive movement. Lord Evander Crail was arrested leaving the library. It did not go quietly. He was a man of pride and connections, and his first response to the magistrate's hand on his arm was to invoke every important name he knew, which was a considerable number. Sefton was taken in the corridor, the documents still in his coat, 3 folded pages, copied in careful hand, detailing every supply depot and deployment position of Ravensmoor's regiment through the spring campaign. Seraphine stood near the east wall and heard every word Crail spoke, heard the moment his confidence shifted into fear, heard the particular silence that fell over the reception as London society began to understand what they were witnessing. Not a social dispute. Not a financial scandal. An arrest for treason. A man they had dined with and consulted about the war being led out with a magistrate's hand on his arm and his medals catching the morning light. Someone nearby said, in a voice of genuine bewilderment, "But who brought this to light?" And the answer, spoken by a voice she didn't know, Ravensmoor. And the Voss woman. The pause. The blind one. The very same. She left the reception immediately after, dossier at her side, coat already on, cane in hand. Caspian found her before she reached the door, pressed through the crowd to where she stood, and she heard his breathing first, slightly unsteady in a way she had never heard from him before. It stopped her. "You should stay," she told him. "Graves needs you. There will be testimony required." "There will be time," he said. He stood close enough that she could feel the warmth of him in the cold corridor. "Seraphine," he said, her name in his voice, still carrying the slight unsteadiness. She stood very still. "Are you—" "I am entirely well," she said. And she was. She was something beyond well. She was herself, fully and without apology, standing in the room where they had laughed at her 6 weeks ago, having done what she had come to do. She pulled on her gloves one finger at a time. "Mr. Parrish has the full written account, dated this morning," she said. "Graves will need it." "I know," he said. "Seraphine." She stopped. "Thank you," he said. She nodded once. She walked out into the gray November morning, and the cold air on her face felt like the beginning of something rather than the end of it. London, late November 1814. The days following the arrest were not quiet ones, though the surface appeared calm. Crail was held and questioned. His connections, the names he had invoked, proved either genuinely ignorant of his treason or sufficiently self-preserving to distance themselves with impressive speed. Holcomb made a full statement within 48 hours, trading complete disclosure for a reduction in his own charge. Beecham was quietly removed from his post and placed in an inactive assignment in Scotland. The war itself, Caspian learned from a dispatch that arrived 3 days after the arrest, had been preserved. The regiment's deployment remained secure, the French had received no usable maps, and the northern pass was held through the winter without the catastrophic interdiction Crail had arranged. Men who would have died did not die. He sat with that in his study at Grosvenor Square and felt the weight of it. The invisible arithmetic of prevented catastrophe, the faces he could put to the numbers. 36 men in Ravensmoor's Forward Supply Company. He knew most of their names. He was very still for a long time. London was unsettled. The arrest of a man of Crail's standing on a charge of treason generated the kind of quiet social earthquake that the city took time to absorb. The drawing rooms processed it in stages. First disbelief, then the hungry recalibration of who had been allied with Crail and whether that alliance was now expensive to admit. Several prominent figures developed sudden and convenient absences from the city. Lady Fontaine withdrew to Hampshire with impressive speed. And through all of it, the name most prominently attached to the exposure, alongside Ravensmoor's, was Seraphine Voss. The blind Duchess. The woman who had heard what no one was meant to hear, who had built a case from invisible threads over 8 months, who had walked back into the room where they had humiliated her and had, with quiet and absolute competence, dismantled the man who orchestrated that humiliation. London was a city that admired power. It was adjusting its assessment with some rapidity, and the adjustment was visible on the faces of people who had never once looked at Seraphine Voss and seen what she actually was. She received 11 letters in the week following the arrest. 3 were from members of parliament, 2 from solicitors, 1 from a general she did not know, and 5 from women who had either mocked her or watched her be mocked and were now writing with the particular breathless sincerity of people who have realized they were catastrophically wrong about something large. She had Dosey read them all while she sat at her desk with a cup of cold tea. She responded to the parliamentary letters with precision and the solicitors with the instruction that all further communication about the Whitmore estate should be directed to Mr. Parrish. The general's letter she held for a long time. It contained an apology for the War Office's failure to act on her earlier communications, written in clumsy official language that she translated accurately as, "We should have listened to you." She wrote back a single page, precise and without rancor, laying out exactly what information she had sent and when, and noting that the chain of information failure was worth examining carefully for future cases. She signed it with her full name, Seraphine Voss, daughter of the late Edmund Voss, 7th Duke of Whitmore. Not a victim. Not a footnote. A source. Caspian came to Blythe Street on the 4th day. He came in the afternoon, later than his usual morning time, when the gray sky had started going dark early the way it did in November. Dosey showed him in but for the first time did not remain in the room. He sat across from Seraphine in the chair that had become his chair, in the room that had become the room where they worked, except there was no work today. The mission was finished. He had no reason to be there that was not itself the reason, and they both understood that clearly. "The regiment will hold the Segura crossing through winter," he said. "I know," she said. "I heard." She always heard. He sat for a moment in the kind of silence that is not absence but presence. "What will you do now?" she asked. He thought about it with genuine honesty. "My solicitor will be in touch with yours about the boundary survey. The manufactured documents have been withdrawn." "I know," she said. Mr. Parrish had told her. "There was never a real dispute," she said. "No, you could have simply told me that on the first day." "I could have," he said. "But then I would not have had a reason to come back." She was quiet for a long time, not the calculating quiet, but the deeper kind, the kind he had learned to read as emotion being carefully managed. He waited with the patience of a man who had learned waiting from the inside out. "There is something I have not told you," she said finally. She told him about Edinburgh, about Dr. Renfrew, about the letter inside the book cover and the possibility, she was precise about this, it was a possibility not a certainty, that her sight might be restored. She told him without drama, the same way she told him everything. He listened without interruption. When she finished, he said nothing for a moment. She heard his breath change slightly, the rhythm of it, and she filed the change away in the part of her that had been mapping him since the beginning. "When will you go?" he said. "After the new year. January if the roads are passable." "I will come with you." She turned toward him. "To Edinburgh?" "Yes. That is, I know what it is," he said. "I am aware it is not a purely practical suggestion. I am making it anyway." She sat with that. She sat with the feeling of it, careful, new, unlike anything she knew how to name precisely. "Why did you not laugh?" she said. He was quiet. "In the ballroom. The night She stopped and started again. "Everyone laughed. I heard every sound in that room. You did not." He considered how to answer. She could tell by the particular quality of his stillness that he was not performing deliberation but actually doing it. "I have seen people fall," he said at last. "On battlefields. After things that would break most people. The ones who got up, there was a particular way they got up. Not fast. Not desperate. They rose slowly, because they were choosing every movement. Because they refused to let the fall define what came after." He paused. "You rose like that." She said nothing. "I had not seen it in a drawing room before," he said. "It seemed like something that deserved to be witnessed properly. Not mocked." She pressed her lips together. She would not cry, she almost never cried, and she would not now. except that what he had said was so plain and so free of pity and so entirely true that it broke something open inside her that she had believed long since sealed. She did not cry, but it was the closest she had come in 4 years. And she thought he knew it, because the room went very gentle. He left at dusk, when the street outside had turned the particular blue-gray of November evenings and the oil lamps were being lit one by one down Blythe Street. She stood at the window. She did not stand at windows often, there was no reason to, but she stood there and felt the cold glass under her fingertips and listened to his footsteps moving away. She had memorized his walk in the first week. The pace of it, the rhythm, the particular weight of a man who moved with intention. She listened until she could no longer hear it, until it disappeared into the general noise of the street and the city beyond, and she stood there a moment longer. DUCHESS came to the doorway and said nothing. She was excellent at nothing when nothing was required. Outside, London moved in its endless roar, indifferent as always, adjusting its opinion of her with the same enthusiasm it had once dismissed her with, which told her everything she needed to know about London. She was not particularly interested in London's opinion. She was interested in Edinburgh. She was interested in January. She was interested in the sound of footsteps disappearing into a city that had never once understood her. That was fine. She understood herself. She always had. London, December 1814. Betrayal was not finished. This was the thing about men who operated in shadow. They had contingencies, and they had allies that surveillance had not fully mapped, and even in custody they could move pieces on a board no one else could see. Graves arrived at Blythe Street on a cold December morning without appointment, his coat damp from rain, his face carrying the expression of a man who has moved faster than he wanted to. He sat in Seraphine's sitting room and spoke plainly. Betrayal had a remaining contact, a fourth party, his insurance, a man who had been paid and tasked before the arrest with a specific directive. If Betrayal fell, eliminate the primary source of his exposure. Eliminate. She had heard the word in civilian contexts before, but hearing it in her own sitting room with the smell of rain on Graves' coat, she understood it in its absolute and final form. Not silence. Not discrediting. A hired man somewhere in London had been paid to ensure she did not reach Edinburgh or any other destination at any other time. Caspian arrived within the hour after Graves, brought by the same messenger, and the three of them sat in the sitting room in a triangle of varying degrees of controlled alarm. She was the least alarmed, which she recognized might appear strange. Perhaps it was that she had been living alongside the awareness of danger for months, and now that it had a specific shape she found it more manageable than the formless version. Or perhaps it was simpler. She had survived blindness, catastrophic loss, and 4 years of London's sustained cruelty, and a hired man in a city she knew by ear was simply the next thing. Caspian was very still, the controlled version of something she could feel without seeing. Graves laid out the protocols. The house on Blythe Street was compromised. She needed to move today. Her one condition, I need to bring the letters. Which letters? All of them. Caspian said, without a second's pause, DUCHESS, begin packing the letter files. DUCHESS, who had been in the doorway since Graves arrived, had already started. They moved her to Grosvenor Square. It was the only suggestion that made all three of them uncomfortable, for reasons they were all too professional to articulate, but it was the most defensible location. The Ravenmore townhouse was well known and well staffed, and an unknown man attempting entry would be noticed. Blythe Street was narrow and ungoverned. She arrived in the late afternoon with DUCHESS and 2 trunks and the self-possession of a woman relocating under extraordinary circumstances without complaint. The housekeeper, Mrs. Stroud, showed her to a room on the first floor facing the square, and she had memorized it within 20 minutes. Caspian placed 2 footmen on extended door duty without announcing he was doing so, but she heard the instructions he gave in the hall with perfect clarity. That evening they had dinner together. The 2 of them, in the dining room of the Ravenmore townhouse, the first meal they had shared without documents spread between them. It was quieter than she expected. In a way she had not prepared for, it felt like something she had been moving toward for a very long time without being willing to call it that. The attack came on the 3rd night. Not through the doors. A professional would expect guarded doors. The hired operative found the ungoverned entrance, a coal hatch in the garden wall that opened into the kitchen passage, used in daylight and forgotten by nightfall. She heard him. She heard him because she slept lightly, always had, and because the house at 3 in the morning had a known sound signature she had memorized in 3 days, and the coal hatch had a specific creak different from any domestic creak of a house settling in the cold. She was awake and sitting up before he reached the kitchen passage. She did not scream. She found the wall beside her bed with one hand, the brass candle holder on the side table with the other, and she waited. His footsteps in the passage were careful, the footsteps of someone who did not know the house. She had been in this house 3 days. She knew the house entirely. She knew the distance from the kitchen passage to the main stairs. She knew the 3rd stair creaked on the left. She counted from that creak to her door, and when the door opened she threw the candle holder at where the face would be, because in her experience a heavy brass object to the face at close range simplified most situations considerably. It connected. There was a sharp, short cry and the sound of impact, and then she was moving, not toward the door, away from it, through the room to the window, which she had confirmed on her first evening opened onto a balcony above the garden. She opened it, stepped out, and shouted one word, clear and full-lunged, "Caspian!" The house woke. She could hear it, boots on floorboards, doors, one of the footmen on the back stairs. The man from the passage was behind her, slower than he should have been for the candle holder, and by the time he reached the window Caspian was in the room with a lamp and 2 footmen were on the stairs, and it was over with the decisive speed of a man who had ended several things in several countries and knew precisely how. She stood on the balcony in the cold December air, no shawl, no shoes, the garden below black and frost quiet, and she breathed and let the cold remind her she was very much alive. Inside she could hear Caspian's instructions, measured and swift. Then his step, singular, specific, crossing the room to the window. "Seraphine." "I am here," she said. "I am entirely well." The pause. "You threw the candle holder." "Yes." "Good," he said simply. "Come in from the cold." The operative talked. Men like him always did, eventually, because Graves was very good at his particular work. What the man revealed was the final piece of Crail's conspiracy. The document transfer had not been fully stopped at Hartwell House. One of the 3 copied maps, the one detailing the Segura crossing where Ravensmore's regiment was camped, had passed through a second channel before the arrest, reaching a French courier already moving toward the coast. It had not yet left England. If it crossed the channel, the regiment would face a devastating ambush before spring. Caspian heard this at 6 in the morning and was out of the house in 20 minutes. She did not try to stop him. She had no right to, and more than that, she had no wish to. He was going to protect his men, which was exactly what he should do, and she understood that as fully as she understood anything. But she stood at the window after his carriage left the square and listened to the silence where his footsteps had been, and the absence was a new kind of quiet that she had not yet learned the exact shape of, and she held it with both hands like something breakable. She spent the day working. It was the only thing that helped. The focus, the precision, the forward motion of ordered thought. She had Dosey bring her files, and she reviewed everything she had assembled about Crail's wider network, looking for threads she had not yet pulled. She found 3. She wrote to Parrish. She wrote to the general who had apologized. She wrote to Graves, detailing connections, dates, and sources with the methodical exactness of someone who had been doing this for long enough to know that the work you do in the space of uncertainty is the work that matters most. By afternoon, she had constructed a supplementary dossier on Crail's continental contacts, people who had met with him during his peacetime trips abroad, who might be running parallel operations through different channels. She did not know if the courier had been stopped. She did not know if the map would cross the channel and the regiment would pay the price of a conspiracy she had worked 8 months to prevent. She sat with that uncertainty and worked through it because there was nothing else to do with it. At 7 in the evening, a note arrived from Graves with a single line. "Courier intercepted at Folkestone. Map recovered. Ravensmore's regiment is safe." She pressed the note flat on her desk with both hands and said nothing for a very long time. London, January 1815. The trial of Lord Evander Crail opened on the 14th of January 1815, in a chamber of the Old Bailey that smelled of cold stone and the accumulated moral weight of every crime ever brought before it. It was not a public spectacle in the way the arrest had been. Treason trials were conducted with a gravity that suppressed theatrics, but London knew, London had known since December, and the gallery was as full as propriety allowed. Seraphine arrived on Mr. Parrish's arm, not Caspian's. He was to testify, and she and Graves had agreed that her arrival independent of him was strategically cleaner. She wore pale gray, the color of winter sky and of her own eyes, and carried her cane, and moved through the entrance with the particular precision of a woman who had decided that the last thing she would ever do was hurry on someone else's account. She heard the gallery the moment she entered, the immediate shift in the room's sound that a crowd makes when something unexpected walks in. She found her seat. She sat. She folded her hands. The stone walls of the Old Bailey were cold on the air. She was entirely, absolutely ready. Caspian testified first, in the clean and precise language of a man accustomed to military briefings. He laid out the manufactured land survey, the strategic value of the Whitmore corridor, the intelligence chain from his initial suspicion to the arrest at Hartwell House. The prosecution barrister, a sharp, precise man named Alfred who had been given her full dossier and used it surgically, presented the chain of evidence with admirable clarity. When the defense attempted to challenge the origins of the investigation, Alfred read aloud from Seraphine's written account. The dates, the sources, the methods, the 3 unanswered letters to the War Office, the recording cylinder, the precise testimony of what she had heard in the library. He read her words with the same weight he would have given a military dispatch. Because that was how she had written them, with the authority of someone who knows exactly what they know and will not be moved from it. There was a moment, just one, when Alfred looked toward where she sat in the chamber and said for the record, "This account was prepared by Seraphine Voss, of Blythe Street, London, daughter of the late Edmund Voss, 7th Duke of Whitmore." A small silence. Then the trial continued. She took the stand herself. It was not customary. It was, by several accounts she heard whispered in the gallery, unprecedented, a woman of her station as a primary witness in a treason trial. The judge allowed it on the basis of the specificity of her evidence and the direct testimony she alone could provide. She stood in the witness position and answered every question in the same plain voice she used for everything, precise, without ornament, without defense. She described what she had heard in the library, word by word. She described the recording device and its use. She described the chain of information she had built over 8 months, the sources, the dates of her letters to the War Office, the intercepted letter from Dr. Renfrew that had told her someone was deliberately managing her access to hope. When the defense barrister attempted to cast doubt on her reliability, suggesting with visible discomfort that a blind witness might have misidentified a voice, she turned her face toward him with a directness that silenced the gallery. "I identified Lord Crail's voice with the same certainty I bring to any evidence I present," she said, quietly and absolutely. "I do not offer testimony I cannot fully support. If I say I heard him, I heard him." Crail looked at her once during her testimony. She could not see it, but Parrish told her afterward, with the deep satisfaction of a man who had never lost a case he deserved to win, that Crail had looked at her from across the courtroom with an expression that combined defeat and recognition. The recognition of someone who has finally understood the thing he profoundly underestimated. She did not feel triumph when Parrish told her this. She felt the completion of a very long task, the closing of a chapter that had cost her considerably. She had been called no threat because she was blind. She had been set aside, ignored, mocked, and methodically obstructed because London's collective imagination could not extend past the cane and the sightless gray eyes and the silence of a woman who did not perform distress for an audience. And that, she had understood from the very beginning, was not her weakness. That had always been her deepest advantage. They had given her the library at Hartwell House because they were certain she was nothing. They had left her in the alcove at the ball because they were certain she couldn't hear. They had sent a hired man through an ungoverned coal hatch because they were certain she slept too deeply to notice. They were wrong. Every single time. The verdict came in 4 hours. Guilty. The sentence was read by a judge who performed the function with both necessity and historical weight, as indeed it deserved. The gallery had the quality of held breath, and then the verdict was recorded and the chamber began to empty. She sat for a moment after most people had moved. Parrish was beside her and said nothing, which was the right choice. She could hear the gallery emptying above, footsteps on stone stairs, voices dropping to the lower register that outdoor spaces permit, the distant sound of carriage wheels on frost-hardened street. She thought of her father sitting by her hospital bed saying, "You are still you." She thought of the brass telescope in the window at Whitmore Hall and the Surrey hills rolled like sleeping shoulders in the early light, and the feeling of being 22 and able to see everything. She thought of Edinburgh and Dr. Renfrew and a letter inside a book cover she had held with both hands for a long time before she could breathe past it. She thought of the sound of footsteps disappearing down Blythe Street. She stood. She straightened her coat. She walked out of the chamber and into the cold January corridor, and each step was hers. He was waiting on the steps. She had not expected this, had assumed he would still be inside, giving final statements to Graves or to Alford. But he was there, on the stone steps of the Old Bailey, in the January cold, his familiar breath just ahead of her. "You didn't wait inside," she said. "It's a better view from out here," he said. She almost laughed, actually almost laughed, which was not nothing. He offered his arm. Not because she needed it, they were both well past the performance of the gesture. He offered it because he was offering it, and they both knew the difference. She took it. They stood for a moment on those steps with London spread out before them in its gray January enormity, coal smoke rising from 10,000 chimneys, the distant voice of the river, carriage wheels on cold stone, and somewhere in the city a newspaper printer setting type that would carry her name before evening. She could feel the cold air on her face and the wool of his coat through her glove and the particular steadiness of a man who had stood at her side for 10 weeks because first it was useful and then it was something else entirely, and who had never once, not once, asked her to be less than she fully was. He said it on the steps of the Old Bailey, which was not where she would have predicted it. He said, "I am going to Edinburgh with you in February, if you'll have me." Not as escort. Not as guard. He stopped. He was not a man who was often at a loss for the right word, which made the pause significant and, she found, somehow very dear. She waited with the patience of a woman who has learned that some things are worth the full length of their own arriving. "I would like to begin again," he said finally, "without the mission, without the necessity. I would like to know you, not as a source or a witness or a partner in strategy, but as—" He stopped again. "You are doing this rather badly," she said. She felt him breathe. "Yes," he said. "I am." The pause. "I am asking if you will let me try. Better. From the beginning, if you are willing." She was quiet for a long moment while London went about its considerable business below them. She thought about all the things she had survived and all the things she had built from the ruins of them. "Ask me questions," she said softly, "and I'll answer them." He looked at her. Then he asked the first one and she answered it. And on the cold stone steps of the Old Bailey, with all of London watching and understanding nothing, something finally, quietly, began. Edinburgh and London, February-April 1815. February came in cold and clear, with a frost that silvered the streets each morning and made the city look, for one brief hour after dawn, like something better than itself. Seraphine and Caspian left for Edinburgh on the 4th of February, traveling by private coach with Dosey and Orwell and enough warming bricks to keep the cold at bay. She had not left London since the accident in 1810, had not allowed herself to think about it, the distances involved, the unknown territory of roads she could not see. She sat in the coach and listened to England change around her. The city's noise faded within an hour, replaced by the particular quiet of winter countryside. Whined through bare hedgerows, the muffled sound of frozen ground under wheels, the occasional creak of the coach on a long hill. It was different from London in a way that was physical, like removing a garment that had been too tight for too long without noticing the tightness. She had not known she was holding her breath until she found herself breathing, deeply, involuntarily, somewhere north of Huntingdon. Caspian was watching her. He looked out the window to give her the moment. She noticed. She said nothing, but she noticed. Dr. Renfrew was a small, precise man who smelled of camphor and pipe tobacco and who spoke to Seraphine as if her blindness were simply a condition to be examined rather than a state that defined her, which she appreciated immediately. He examined her over 2 mornings with instruments and careful questions. His verdict, delivered with the honesty of a man who had learned that hope and risk must be offered together or not at all. The trauma to her optic nerve had left a partial obstruction which he believed was surgically removable. The surgery carried genuine risk. Recovery would require weeks of patience. Success was possible but not guaranteed. He put the probability at better than even. She listened to this in a room that smelled of Edinburgh winter and old books, and let herself hold it plainly, without flinching from either the hope or the risk. Both deserved to be seen clearly. "When," she said. "The surgery?" "Whenever you are ready. The timing is entirely yours." She had not brought Caspian into the examination. She sat alone in the chair across from Dr. Renfrew in her own silence and said, "The week after next. If that can be arranged." It could be. She told Caspian that evening in the front room of the lodging house they had taken near Edinburgh Castle, where a coal fire was doing its sincere best against the northern cold. She told him the surgery was scheduled. She told him the probability. She told him the risk, stated plainly, without softening. He listened with the same absolute attention he brought to everything that mattered, and when she finished, he said, "I will be there." She said, "You don't need to stay in Edinburgh for 2 more weeks." He said, "I know." She said, "The house in Grosvenor Square will need," he said, "Seraphine." She stopped. "I know I don't need to stay," he said. "I am telling you that I want to." There is a considerable difference between those 2 things, and I believe you understand the difference better than most people, because you are the most exact person I have ever met in my life. She sat with that for a long moment. Outside, Edinburgh moved in its northern way, quieter than London, the cold more honest about what it was. "There is something else," she said. "After the surgery, whatever the outcome, I will be pressing the Whitmore title claim through Parliament. Mr. Parrish believes the case is now substantially stronger." "Good," he said immediately. "You should have the title. It was always yours." The surgery lasted 4 hours. She did not remember much of it. Dr. Renfrew's assistants had given her a preparation that muffled time into something softer, but she remembered the smell of the room and the cold and the strange sensation of being entirely in the hands of someone else's precision, which was a thing she had not experienced since she was 22 and lying in a physician's room with the world gone dark. She woke in a room she could not see, which was the same as waking in any room of the last 4 years, and she lay still and sorted the sounds. The fire, a window, the close stillness of a room with someone else present. A breathing, specific and familiar. "I'm awake," she said. "I know," Caspian said. He was in the chair beside the bed. The surgeon came within the hour and made his assessment. The obstruction had been successfully removed. There was swelling. The swelling would need to resolve, perhaps days, perhaps longer. He could not tell her yet what she would see when the bandages came off. He told her to rest and be patient. She almost laughed. After 4 years of the most sustained and disciplined patience in the history of one woman's survival, he was recommending patience. She thanked him politely. She rested. The bandages came off on the 10th day. The room was deliberately dark. Dr. Renfrew had been precise about sudden light. Caspian stood near the window with the heavy curtains drawn. She sat in the chair before the covered window and breathed and let Dosey remove the last layer of bandage and kept her eyes closed. One more moment of the dark she had known for 4 years. The dark that had been her world, her element, the territory she had mapped and mastered and lived in so completely that she had stopped thinking of it as absence and started thinking of it as a different kind of presence. She let herself hold that for just a moment, the dark that had broken her and made her stronger in the breaking, the dark in which she had heard treason in an alcove and footsteps in a coal passage and the specific voice of a man not laughing when a room full of people laughed. She would not be ashamed of it. She would carry it as what it was, the 4 years that made her exactly who she was. Then she opened her eyes. The curtains moved. Just slightly, Caspian had drawn 1 inch, the way Dr. Renfrew had instructed, letting in a thin line of February Edinburgh light, pale and exact. And she saw it. She saw. Not everything, not all at once. The world came in fragments, the way hearing returns after great noise, piece by piece assembling itself into meaning. A line of gray-white light. The dark shape of the curtain's edge. The pale square of the window frame. And then, as her eyes adjusted by increments too slow to measure and too significant to name, more. The room around her, softly lit by the low coals of the fire, the chair where she had sat for 10 days, the desk with Dosie's things on it. And beside her, near the window, a man in a dark coat who had stood in 2 consecutive darknesses, hers and his, without ever once asking her to be grateful for it. Who had stood in a ballroom and refused to laugh. Who had come to Blythe Street and told her the truth and let her tell him hers. She looked at him, clearly, for the first time, with her own unassisted sight. She looked at him for a long moment. And then she said, "I thought you would be taller." London received its Duchess in April, when the last of the frost had given way and the city was remembering the color green. The Whitmore title claim was resolved in Parliament after a session that Mr. Parrish described, with considerable understatement, as vigorous. The precedent of Seraphine Voss, blind heir, intelligent source, primary witness in a treason conviction, survivor of a hired assassin, and author of a supplementary intelligence dossier that the War Office had since used to dismantle 2 additional continental networks, made certain arguments very difficult to sustain. She was recognized as the 8th Duchess of Whitmore, holding the title in her own right, the first woman to do so in the history of that dukedom. London, which had called her the Blind Duchess as a taunt for 4 years, watched as she arrived at the reception in her honor with her sight restored, her head level, and the Duke of Ravenmore beside her, and it had the grace, finally, at considerable delay, to applaud. Not because she needed its applause. She had never needed it. But because even London occasionally, grudgingly, recognizes when it has been irreversibly and completely wrong about something. She looked out at the crowd with clear gray eyes that had been dark for 4 years. She simply saw it, all of it, exactly as it was. That was enough. That had always been enough. She was still herself. She had never been anything else. If this story moved you, share it with someone who needs to hear it. And remember, drop a comment below with your country and the time where you're watching. Your presence matters.